Dear guests, dear participants, welcome to the second day of the fifth conference, NEPC conference. And I'm very glad to introduce you a panel we'll have today, Education Policy Networks. Who needs them and why? And we have guests representing three largest education policy networks. Mali Dermish, Serious Policy Network on Migrant Education, Esther Salomon, European Education Policy Network on Teachers and School Leaders, and Lana Zhurka Network of Education Policy Centers. As you know, in the past 20 years, many informal and formal education policy networks were set up with the idea that synergizing findings, exploring different policy options, forming common recommendations and common advocacy actions will move education policy forward. The three networks represented today here in our panel, they have different histories, scopes, policy goals, types of activities, membership profile, but however, they also share some common goals and even some members. The presentation of the experience hopefully will provide a place for rethinking the roles of networks. The panel hopes to unpack the roles of policy networks in international and national policy development and discuss their roles in supporting and preserving the participative policy processes. I would like to start with our guests presenting shortly their networks, followed by Lana, and then I will be asking questions. Just to know that we'll have 2 questions to all networks, and then around 5 questions addressed individually to each of the networks. So, dear guests, floor is yours. Who will start?
I can start.
Yes, please.
The European Education Policy Network is, I think, the youngest of the three present here, but we also have a history because we are working on the basis of a previous policy network called the European Policy Network on School Leadership, NEPC. EEPN is a research-based network. We have a lot of researcher members, but we are basically bringing together research, policy, and practice, trying to offer evidence-based policy recommendations and also spreading some inspiring practices within our network and also beyond that. And at the moment, we have just grown. So at the moment, EEPN has 33 members from 21 countries, and 19 of the 21 countries are EU members. We also have Serbia and Norway as in the membership.
I can go next. Hi, so my name is Mieli Dermish and I'm representing the Serious Policy Network on Migrant Education. So Serious is currently the international leading network that works on migrant education. We serve as the EU's advisor and have done on these topics since about 2011, 2012. We're made up of educational researchers. We have observer members who are policymakers. We also have practitioners, so some EU teacher groups and students as well. And we also have migrant-led organizations as well as other organizations that do direct service work with refugee and migrant and minority students.
Thank you, Miali and Esther, and most of you know, but still to present Network of Education Policy Centers. So it's an international non-governmental membership organization. We gather 27 members, 25 of them full members from 22 different countries. The region we cover is slightly different from EEPN and Sirius because we cover a vast geographical region. So we go from Estonia to Mongolia, down to Turkey. But we shared the history of the transition starting in the 1990s. And this history is developed in different ways. So we kind of now say that we have 3 regions. If you look at politically, so we have some countries which are EU members. We have those pre-accession countries, the IPA countries, and then the neighborhood. And that's how we have region A, B, and C, as we call them. It was founded in 2006 and grounded in belief that educational change is the key to the societal change and a better future. The underpinning value in all our work is social justice, and this concept has evolved as a network, and we are now moving towards ecological justice. And based on these values, all our programs and projects concentrate on inclusion in its most comprehensive possible view. So we are a policy network, but it's important to point out that we see policy work not only as monitoring and influencing change at legislation level, but also in piloting different policy options at school level. Regarding levels of policy, we live in between worlds of international, national, regional, all the way down to school policy level. We work exclusively on general education, so we don't deal with higher education or preschool education, although some of our members work in that area, but as a network, only general education. And finally, perhaps it's important to say that we see ourselves both as a support network, offering support and services to members, but also as an advocacy network in promoting and advocating for policy change. So that's a short introduction from me. Thank you. Olivia, your mic is off.
Sorry. Thank you very much, dear guest, dear Lana. So I move to our questions. And my first question is to all 3 network representatives. International policy network starts from a premise that together they have a stronger voice that will influence national education policies. Would you agree with the premise, and how impactful is this approach?
I woke up thinking about this, so I'll start. I think it's because the premise itself is maybe based on a couple of assumptions that it's worth unpacking before we move forward with it. And those assumptions are, firstly, that collective action in general works, that more people make a bigger voice, and a bigger voice changes things. And then the other one is that there's a sort of legitimacy, I think, that's conveyed when we have international counterparts, that we assume that, well, this has been done in 3 other countries, therefore it is now evidenced and we can now do it in our country, or push for it or advocate for it. And I think that in the domain of education, it's very difficult for that second thing to happen, because education is a very national and realistically a local and sometimes school-based affair. And so national politics, certainly in the area that we work in, because we deal with migration politics, anti-racism politics, it's very sort of hotly debated national ideas. And when we think of them, we don't necessarily want to do what our neighbors are doing, because we have opinions about whether that works and whether that doesn't work. As for the collective action, I think it can sometimes be the same. I do think that that ministries of education and that local education authorities are very good at listening to their stakeholders and their counterparts, but they really need to come from within the system. It needs to be the teachers that are striking. it needs to be the parents that are saying, absolutely no, I'm not going to send my kids to school. And sometimes when it's other people, I don't think it's as effective. But having said that, I would say that the time that I've spent with Sirius and the stories that I've heard and what we've noticed is that you really depend on the legitimacy of your actual counterpart in country. So if your counterpart has a strong relationship with the people that they're trying to advocate change with, or if your counterpart has a strong research background or a profile for doing, piloting positive initiatives, really changing communities and schools, and that is the case in other places, then you're bringing together people in this network that can peer coach each other, that can peer learn, that can figure out how to move things forward just by being in a space together, and then going into their national context and using that as a sort of strong place to launch from. So that's sort of how I feel about it.
Yeah, well, I can build on what you've been saying, and I can say that, well, I partly agree with that because, yeah, well, the policy and practice realities are like that. I think it's very different what kind of bigger impact a policy network can have with this collective voice, and it largely depends on national cultures. So, for example, EAPN was dealing with the challenges, new roles and competencies of teachers and school leaders in the digital age in the past year. And we have members who were very happy to see that this is also high on the agenda of other countries, because for them, it's a good tool to influence their national policymakers. While in some other countries, it will be just out of the question. I'm Hungarian myself. But there is a good reason why Hungary is not a member of the EPN. So usually I think that even joining a policy network is some kind of wish to build on this collective wisdom. Where we have found a huge added value, it's just an additional component to what Miali was just saying, is that our own research method is very, very heavily building on our members, which means that when a country or a region or a school is looking for solutions, then through EAPN, they may find inspiration that they will not find in any other way, because these inspirations are originally not available in languages that they speak. So a huge added value is that if there is an inspirational practice from Lithuania or Norway or Malta, our colleagues are helping us to understand what it is and why it is working, and sharing it with others in a shared common language, which is English in this case. So I would just add this third element to the added value of policy networks, that you can dig into inspiration that otherwise would be very difficult for you to find. Because once you have found it, you can use all kinds of artificial intelligence translators. You can pick the brains of colleagues who've been working on a certain initiative, but actually finding them and starting to think about it is a huge linguistic issue, and these international networks are a very good forum for that.
Yeah, I agree with both colleagues on all things. The premise that the collective voice is stronger when it's international is, I think, something that we kind of naively believed when we started, because it's not really that just because somewhere else something is working, the national policymakers or even the stakeholders at national level will take up this idea and move forward with it. Because yes, education is a very ingrained thing into the society and culture. So I think what gives us some kind of advantage when we work in NEPC is this type of comparative mapping studies, which we do, which are research-based, where we actually look at similarities, commonalities, and differences between different systems and try to see if things work, in which context they work, and so on. I would say that what networks really do though, for everybody in them and from the wider community of the, let's say, networks of members, so it becomes enlarged, is this place of dialogue. So we open questions that we might not ask at national level because we see something somewhere else. And we go deeper into thinking about what education could be. So I would say that at the level of changing national policy, it is up to the national stakeholders, and that international networks really don't have so much they cannot influence it directly. And I think this is seen from bigger organizations than ours. I mean, we could look at UNESCO, or we could look at all the UN different networks, or other, even EU as a let's say guide to education in European Union, and how much national stakeholders take or not take from it. And actually, when you look at it, they don't take so much. But there is this value of opening a dialogue, of learning how it is in other cultures. I think in this global world that we are living with more and more, this opening views to other systems is something that networks are really good at and very important. And the second thing I would say is that for an organization like ours, which is mostly NGOs, so very, in a way, different from both EEPN and Sirius, is that it gives us strength to continue because we struggle together. So this idea that there are other people in this world who are doing the same thing with the same passion and with the same gusto, I think helps us to continue to work.
Thank you so much. It was rather thoughtful introduction. And I will continue again with the next question addressed to all. And so, who is a primary target of your work? Maybe we'll go again. Esther or Malib, yes, please, please.
Sorry. Yeah, well, I think for Sirius, we would definitely say the European Union in terms of their aim to coordinate education a little bit more. And from there, obviously, national ministries within the European Union. Although I would say that another target for us are other European stakeholders that perhaps work a little bit on our issue, but that we feel we should be closer to and understand more about their issues so that we can try and advocate for genuinely inclusive in education, which doesn't just include migrants and minorities, but in fact includes many groups of marginalized students, families and children.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, well, our target groups are similar. Of course, we are in conversation with the European Commission, and we're trying to convey our messages to other European institutions. Through our members, we definitely would like to also have an influence on national policymaking. But since our focus is teachers and school leaders and a really wide variety of topics around them, in this case, policymaking often happens on school level. So we are definitely targeting the school level as a policymaking level because a very, very big percentage of research findings do not depend on national policymaking, but rather on the policies that schools or groups of schools collaborating with each other are implementing for quality and inclusive education. But of course, at the end of the day, even when we are focusing on teachers and school leaders, this is not a trade union network. So we are focusing on high professionalism for the children. So our ultimate target group is all children, and our wish is for them to receive the best possible education. So I just wanted to make it clear that this is not something that is like a trade union movement, but something really seriously professional.
Thank you. Thank you. And Lana?
Yeah, again, like here, maybe slightly different, being that we are a support network as well. So I would say that our actually primary target are our members, in the sense that Everything we do is for members, either in the sense of supporting them in different things that we do through projects, programs, different support actions where we enable change between members, different types of learning for members, and so on. So somehow the biggest target for us is members, with this idea that, of course, they are the ones at national level whose primary target then is in the end the learners. As Esther said, it's all children and all students. But I would also say that on the other hand, our targets are international. So what we're trying to do is somehow bring the voice of the region, which is actually not quite well heard in the global arena, of this between the developed and I don't even want to use the other word because we don't know how to define these regions in the global setting, but in this realm of neither being those receiving aid nor those giving aid to others. Let's say if we look at the world as it is, our voice from the region is often not heard. So the knowledge from our region is not what we see as the good knowledge or the valuable knowledge. The good and valuable knowledge comes from the north and the west, not from our region. So then our target is also the international arena where we try to bring the voices of our region into the international discussions and dialogues.
Thank you very much. And now I move from rather general questions to questions addressed to each of the networks specifically. And I would like to start with the questions to Sirius. Is the relatively narrow scope of Sirius policy focus an advantage or a disadvantage in bringing the issue to the policy agenda?
It's such a good question. 10 years ago, 10 years ago when Sirius started, it was started originally as a project funded by the European Union. And they funded 4 separate topics then, one of which was migrant education. And it's clear that in a way, Sirius has sort of been defined by that initial policy leaning of the European Commission. They want to have a specific focus on this. It makes it easier for them to fund various initiatives. It makes it easier for them to understand initiatives. I think that it's a very complicated thing to do, to take aspects of people's lives and personalities and separate them from who they are. And we see more and more today about intersectionality. We see activities and projects that work with for example, migrants who are living in rural communities and are also LGBTQI. We see all these different layers on top of each other. And I think it's important as humans, when we discuss our issues, to recognize that intersectionality and to recognize that we are not defined by one small element that happens to make up our belonging or our sense of person. At the same time, pushing that message towards the big funders, to the philanthropists, and trying to explain the importance of coordinated action, coordinated funding action, coordinated policy action in the arena of intersectionality, in the arena of inclusion, in the arena of diversity. But the world that we live in is not a world where we are yet ready, certainly at the policy level, to recognize that humans are complex and the world is complex. And so we currently fund and undertake practices and policies that are more directed and specified at certain groups. So I think it depends on the funding environment, and right now it works as an asset. I would love to see the day in 10 or 15 years where we no longer have to divide ourselves in this way. Oh, your microphone, Ulrija.
Sorry. My next question is to EPN. You focus on EU countries, and do you see any results in the EU policy agenda setting?
Well, it's a difficult question because, well, we are a young network. We started in 2019. So it's relatively difficult to say how much impact we have. Actually, the coming year will be a test year for that because the European Commission is asking us to follow topics that are very high on the EU policymaking agenda. So we will see how much our research and our research-based policy recommendations will have an influence on what policy documents will be published by the European Commission. At the same time, I would like to say that yes, but probably not on the widest policy agenda setting, because what we have worked on so far were more or less putting flesh on the bones that the European Commission has published as their policy recommendations or policy guidance. Because we were dealing with topics that were part of current EU policy making, and we were trying to find the inspiration and analyze why different approaches to finding solutions or offering a certain type of implementation of one or another policy area can work. Ever since the European education area has been initiated at the Gothenburg Summit, teachers and their professional preparedness and their professionalism have been a focal point of EU policymaking. It hasn't been like that before. There were several other policy iterations that did include teachers and school leaders, but now, ever since Gothenburg, teachers are in the focus, and I would like to believe that it is also an impact of our predecessor, the EPNOSL network, the European Policy Network on School Leadership, that finally the European Commission and in general European level policymaking has understood that school leaders have a special and different role from teachers, because very often the conversation or the whole discourse is only about teachers, but without good leadership and visionary leadership, people who can make decisions, make the best decisions for helping their staff, professional development, arranging the working conditions. We can train teachers as much as we want, but there will be no real impact on the quality of education. So my answer is yes and no. Yes, and we don't know yet. But I honestly hope that what our colleagues are doing, especially in doing the research and developing tentative recommendations, will help. What we see, and in our discussions with the European Commission, it comes up, is that our policy recommendations, since the final policy recommendations are a result of a lot of discussions and also negotiations with different stakeholders, are probably too general, and we are trying to work on being a little bit more specific. But I don't think it really helps EU policymaking more, because EU policymaking works generally with more general policy recommendations. Given the diversity of school systems in Europe, it can probably help more the national implementation of the recommendations. So yeah, well, yes, and we will see.
Thank you. Yes, we'll see, I hope. And my next question is it's for NEPS, and these vast geopolitical differences in the countries of your membership are evident. And how do you find common ground in advocacy and topics you cover?
Okay, I will definitely answer that question, but if I can just reflect on what Mihaly and Esther said quickly, and I'm sorry, Olivia, but I just wanted to, I think it's important that we look at this aspect of what Mihaly talked about, these targeted policies for specific groups, which of course are needed, I would say. And in a way, the Serious Network, when it was founded, and how can I say, it makes completely sense. The problem is that we then go with targeted rather than universal policies, which is definitely something that the world is moving towards, and that we know that benefits inclusion the best. And the intersectionality and all of the rest of it actually is proof of it. So yeah, I think networks like Sirius are definitely needed to bring, let's say, focus on a certain group that is, but what we fight for through Sirius, I guess, should be universal policies. So this would be my idea, and maybe also why NEPC is part of Sirius, is because this is where we see it. And also about this point on school leaders, which I think is very important, because they are, and in our region as well, invisible part of the system. We know how important they are, yet when all the support that is, and when we talk about it, it's always about the teachers and school leaders are somehow disregarded or not supported enough. So I just want to say that we as at the network see value in both of these approaches in a way, but I think that what we really need to move forwards to is an educator as a all educators or all people in schools on one hand, and on the other hand, universal policies which will move things forward. And yes, for this vast geopolitical, yes, we are huge geographically. We have very different types of systems, as I already said. We have countries which are in EU. We have huge countries like Russian Federation or Turkey, Kazakhstan with 3 time zones and millions of teachers and students. So, and then we have small countries like, I don't know, Slovenia with 2 million people and, I don't know, 200 schools. So it's really just from the sizes of the countries, it's very different. What was always interesting for me from the very beginning of working in NEPS, and I've been with NEPS from the beginning, is that how similar the problems are. And this, I think, is globally true. And when I talk to colleagues from Africa or South America or Far East, we still find that all the issues in schools or education policies are actually very similar. We're struggling with teacher preparedness. We're struggling with supporting students to reach their potential. We're fighting the ministries for more resources. We're talking about integrity and corruption in education, admission policies, elite schools. I mean, wherever you look, parental participation. So the issues are the same. So it's really not hard to find common issues. I think what is hard with this vast geopolitical is how to find recommendations or things that would work for all, and they don't work for all. So this is not something we can do. Not all solutions work everywhere, and I think this copy-pasting policies that's happening across the world, coming again from the West and the North as a solution to everything, is very bad, and we need to learn on both sides. So this exchange of learning has to be both South, North, and East, West as well, and all the other possible combinations. And the other thing I would say that is difficult is how to advocate for change. So in some countries, this type of Western advocacy, where we go to the policymakers and we give them evidence and we say this is the good solution and this will produce best results, does not always work. So it's very important in our work to have really open mind about how we can influence policy. And really an open mind in the sense that we are really open to dialogue with everybody. And even when we have autocratic or semi-autocratic governments or whatever happens, we don't want to close the conversation, because if we close the conversation, nothing will change. So it's really about adapting. Of course, there are levels where we don't go beyond. We don't approve things which are against human rights. We will never support things like that. But talking to everybody is one big thing that we try to do, and keeping our doors and minds open.
Thank you very much. And my next question is to both Sirius and EVPN. It's about power of networks. European Commission, who initiated and still funds the networks, insisted on multi-stakeholder networks, including policymakers. In your experience, does this approach support the national debate? How do you coordinate different interests of memberships?
Well, can I start? Okay. Well, this is a very complex question, and I have at least 3 different answers to this. Well, on the one hand, I think that what really supports national debate is the rigorous research-based nature of VPN. Our rigorous research base is a very specific one. We have a very special approach to research. We are not using any usual tools for desk research, but we are inviting our members to submit their own examples, their own fresh research evidence, their own policies that can be analyzed. And of course, in some cases, these are biased ones. We know that well, that kind of research exists, that a certain stakeholder group orders to support their narratives. But at the end of the day, the researchers are independent, and the outcomes of the research that then the members can use on the national level are unbiased. And well, even if, for example, one stakeholder group emphasizes a certain feature in their own submitted research, if another 3 independent research sources say something else, then the outcome will be probably not very attractive for that stakeholder group, but at the same time, something that is really strongly evidence-based. So this is the first answer. The second is that, and it's partly EEPN experience, partly my personal experience, is that these international fora are very often a very good possibility for stakeholders who normally don't speak to each other at home to meet and discuss. And it can support the initiation of some kind of collaboration also on national level. For this reason, we are incentivizing the members of the network to bring other people, policymakers, other stakeholders to the annual conferences, where you can also discuss in a very informal way in the coffee breaks, during dinner, and in, well, these kinds of really inspiring informal settings. The third answer will be the well, the not so positive one. It is difficult because it is just the nature of these policy networks and the outcomes that we're working with. It's good and bad that basically what we produce can be used as, you know, like an offer, and different stakeholders will pick the messages that are in line with their own messages, which probably will be or could be conflicting with messages by the others. Well, you probably will not be surprised, and this is why I was emphasizing that we are not a trade union network, is that when it comes to a multi-stakeholder approach, very often the outcomes are not fully in line with what trade unions, teacher trade unions are advocating for. So it is a big question mark how much, for example, teacher professional organizations will be able to have a better dialogue with national level trade unions, but I really hope that it is also going to improve in the years to come. We are trying to accommodate for as many stakeholder interests as possible, but as I said, we are really trying to have this very rigorous evidence-based approach, and there is a very good reason why the most important deliverables are all coordinated by somebody who has not been involved in the politics part of policymaking ever. It's a professor from the University of Plymouth, not even EU. Well, this is how we are trying to overcome the difficulties. But there are always differences. But I also have to agree with Lana that at the end of the day, when it comes to different stakeholders, once they start discussing, they start realizing that their problems are very, very similar.
Yes, yes. Thank you very much. Thank you.
There's a lot in that, and also I want to reflect a bit on both what Esther's just said, but also what Lana said earlier, because it's this idea of you know, like you say, it's the European Commission funding networks to exist, and they're saying, well, you should have the policymakers involved, and then you've got to have the educational researchers, and don't forget you need some practitioners, and so the question is, does this actually make any national change at all? But this is again a sort of northern Western way of doing policymaking. Look, we're pushing this. This is how it happens. It's always evidence-based. This is how we move forward with things. And, you know, we live in a Western, rational, empirical, scientific world, and let's change it to make it better. But as, you know, Esther says, you know, there are many hearts and thoughts on the table. And the idea of a multi-stakeholder network or a multi-stakeholder forum, just a meeting, is that we're supposed to try and bring everyone to an eye level and give everyone the same value so that a genuine conversation can arise, and then perhaps some co-collaboration in how we go about addressing things. But that first stage of actually bringing people to an eye level is very, very hard. In our network, we have much fewer policymakers than we do educational researchers. And it's something that we are trying to address by showing the value of being part of a network like ours. But there is still an immense disparity between how we think of ourselves when we come to a table with other people, and that will remain a problem until we find ways to sort of break it down. So I think that when we talk about that national debate, and does it help that we ask policymakers that are being led by a carrot by the European Commission to our table? Sometimes not. We have some policymakers who've opted to be in Sirius in the last year or so, and we sort of have the impression that they're just sort of watching to see what happens, because they don't know how to interact in this forum. They've no idea what to do. Some of it's very interesting, and we've heard that they've taken some of the things that we've done and done them back elsewhere, more in format than in policy change. And well, they had a conversation like this, let's try and have a conversation like that and see how it works. But I think it's as Esther says, you know, everyone has their issue that they think is important, and you can present them with a fair amount of evidence, but they're still seeing things from their perspective. And at the end of the day, we're sort of dealing with humans. And so we have to become better somehow at dealing with humans and accepting that everyone needs to come to the table feeling valued and not feeling like they're better than anyone else, and actually able to share what their experience is, because those lived experiences of the students and of the teachers and of the school heads and of the policymakers are the genuine data and material that will make a change.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And our last question today is to Lana about NEPS. Do you hear me? Yes, okay. And my last question is about What is your approach to reaching national policy arena as a NEPS?
Mm. And then again, I have such a need to respond to what Mihaly and Esther said. I'm sorry. Because I think what we heard from both of them is this difficult. I mean, in one hand, we are lucky because we're not in a way a multi-stakeholder network. I mean, our members are either NGOs or academics, so it's either research or and in a way members of a wider civil society. So we don't have an issue with having policymakers in the membership. But of course, we need to deal with policymakers, students, parents, and all other stakeholders on a daily level. So I think what both Esther and Mihaly pointed out is this idea of participation and who participate and who's at the table, and who has a voice or doesn't have a voice. I think this is one big point for NEPS, and I think pandemic also brought it even higher on our agenda as a network is how do we reach those voices which are unheard? How do we bring them to the table with policymakers at the equal level? But I also think that we always have to remember that in the end, policymakers do have a higher responsibility to what happens in education than, and this is something that for us is much easier maybe to criticize policymaking, to policymakers or policy in general sometimes when you don't have members who are, because once they are members of your network, you have kind of, I mean, they're either members or they're not. And if you're working, yeah, you're either supporting all your members. You can't say some people are equal, but the others are more equal than others in membership. So I know that both Sirius and EPN have different solutions, whether they're observers rather than full members and so on. So it becomes very difficult because there is this obvious power relationship between them. And I think that is what Mihaly is talking about when she said bringing them to the same eye level, is because there is not equal power. And then even when we talk about participation of different groups, whether it's students or teachers on that level, or we talk about the voices of the most vulnerable groups or marginalized, whether it's LGBTI or whether it's migrant groups or whether it's ethnic or linguistic minorities, we have problems because when we do have voices of teachers and when we do have voices of students, is it those that are the most vulnerable, and how do we reach them? So for us, I think that is a continuous question, is how do we finally get those voices out, and how do we know what they mean, what they need, not what they mean, what they need, and how do we support this dialogue the best way? So yeah, I think in a way, NEPT is in an easier position there because there is no demand from anybody that we have multi-stakeholder networks. We do need to still find ways of communicating with everyone. About how do we get to the national arena, again, here we totally rely on our members. There is, let's say, a procedure in becoming a NEPS member, but all our members are very strong voices in their countries. They're really strong figures as organizations and as individuals in national arenas. So this is, we kind of support them to do it in their country, and the way we support them is either with evidence, so that's one way. The other way is that we provide sometimes, cooperation with different stakeholders they might need a speaker or a researcher on a certain topic or something like that. But basically, we leave it in the good hands of our members to do it in the national context.
Thank you very much, dear guests, dear Lana. Our questions to you are over. Thank you very much for your comprehensive answers. And we are lucky having 9 minutes for questions from participants. Dear participants, please raise your questions.
It's always this difficult, who's going to ask first, or
Yeah.
because we're not in school.
Betsan? Yes,
Well,
please.
just Well, I just enjoyed listening and learning from you. I'm from the US, so I really am just a listener because I'm working in some of these European countries. Um, if I was to start a policy center in my context, there's a good chance it would be dedicated to stopping policy making. Because in my experience, if I'm trying to help the people on the ground, they experience policy making as highly disruptive and absorbing enormous amounts of energy and not necessarily capacity building for themselves, depending on the context that they're in. So I'm just kind of curious about how your organizations work, not just with trying to push more positive capacity building policies up the agenda, but how you try to stop all the other kinds of policies. Especially when, in my experience, rational research is the least of it in terms of what is helping policy get made anyway. So,
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
So
August, Manny?
it's a great question. I think when I was studying policy, like educational policy, I read a paper that said that it took 20 years for any educational policy in the US to make it from someone's office to a kid's life. And I don't think that that figure's far off in Europe either. So it's also, you know, that complete disconnect between policy and practice that sort of that you've evoked in your question. I'm going to respond with just an example because I think it's maybe a bit more tangible. In one of the countries that we work in, Bulgaria, recently, we had a multi-stakeholder meeting, and because our quite vibrant member there had done a lot of networking and spent a lot of time building a core group of people over the last few years that really wanted to change things for newly arriving refugee students. There was actually a policy change the Ministry of Education committed to, which is that they would now add on new ways to assess newly arriving students. So not just language, basically assessment, but also questions like, what did you want to be when you were in your old school? What were your favorite subjects? A more of a sort of whole child approach. Now, that was a couple of months ago, and I would love to circle back to you in a year to let you know how that has actually impacted the lives of newly arriving kids that come into that system at the age of 16, 15. But I think it is an example of how bringing everyone to a table and how policymakers listening to young people who've experienced, you know, an education that they felt could have been a lot better, and NGOs that are doing non-formal and other support for these kids, can actually make a policy change that might actually make a difference. So in terms of stopping policies that are not useful, I don't know if I have a really good understanding of that yet, but maybe Lana has, or Esther does. So I think they have more experience in this policy network arena than I do.
Well, in our case, I think that this kind of discouragement of constant policy changes, because I think this is what you are implying with your question, that basically, well, you need time to find out whether your local practice, or, well, in our definition, school level education policy works or not. And of course, when national level education policy changes all the time, it really is really disruptive. Basically, whatever topics we have touched so far in EEPN, are leading us to emphasizing school level and teachers' professional autonomy. And this is something that in many countries you still need to push for. Not just for giving this autonomy, but also for national level or regional level creating the circumstances for an autonomy that is not overwhelming, but at the same time supports individual or school level education policy approaches. Miali was giving you an example from Bulgaria. I can also speak from my own experience in Hungary, where we had a period of full autonomy without national level policymaking offering the necessary professional support. So teachers were absolutely happy. The overwhelming majority of teachers were absolutely happy when there was a 180-degree change, and now we have a fully centralized education policy, more or less the proverbial French type. And if it's Wednesday, 15th of May, then every fifth grader will learn about the Romans in France or in Hungary. But at the same time, again, school leaders have a very important role, because even in this very strict Hungarian system, with the necessary support that they are picking up from different sources, like from policy networks, a lot of school leaders are just resisting national policy, and they are carrying out their school level policy just as it was. So it's a very complex issue, and well, we all know that constant policy changes on national level are really, really disruptive. At the same time, if you look at the numbers that made the European Commission to change their headline targets from focusing on early school leaving only, which basically resulted in a much higher level of students actually having a school leaving certificate, but not having very basic reading, writing, and numeracy skills, there still is a need for, in most of Europe, because even in Western Europe, even in the best countries, there are frighteningly high numbers of children going to school, attending school until the end of compulsory education, and leaving with a certificate and not being able to have basic reading or writing. So there is a need to change, but it should be something that is offered some time to actually implement and try, and not to change every 2 years, because we all know that in education, nothing changes in 2 years. I mean, deeply.
Thank you very much. We have only 1 minute left. Lana, would you like to?
I'll try to very quickly, although I can't do
Please.
it in maybe 3 minutes. Esther has to leave us, I think, so I would just like to thank her. I know she needs to leave
Thank
at
you very
exactly.
much. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I have another meeting starting in a minute.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. Thank you so much. But just quickly, because I think it's a big topic, of course, the big reforms. I will start with an anecdote. I think in the early 2000s, Chile had a big success in education. They had huge success. And when I was there at the conference, I think, I can't remember which year, but early 2000s, there was a question to the bureaucrats in the ministry, how did you do it? And they said, we were very lucky because we had a minister without a vision. And because minister didn't have a vision and didn't wake up every other day with a new idea, we had a good 8 years of doing things and changing things slowly without these disruptive policy reforms. Yeah, sometimes a minister without idea might also be a good thing. But that aside, I think what really is our role to stop the disruptive policy reforms is to empower those in schools to be the advocates for their own professions. So what we see is that teachers and school leaders and others in school feel like they cannot influence anything. So this is bad for many things. On one hand, when change comes, they're not willing to accept it because, this is the 20th time they're changing the bureaucratic procedure or something, and I'm not interested. I will still go into my classroom and do whatever I want Because in the end, when the doors of the classroom are closed, the teacher will do what they will do. And the good teachers will do good teaching, and some that are not so good might not do good teaching. So that's so I think what we really need to do is to empower the professionalism of those in school leaders and teachers, for them to fight for meaningful change, and also to fight against unmeaningful change. Thank you.
Thank you very much for our guests, for joining us, for presenting your networks. Thank you to all participants for joining our session today. And now we will have a next session. Yes, Lana, am I right? And we just can use this link to either stay or leave. Manny,
Yeah, no,
thank you so
you will
much.
all leave because the next session, thank you, Olivia, but just yes, so you can all leave because the next session starts at 12:30, so you have a full hour between.
Yes, great. Thank you so much. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you, Olivia. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Nice
you.
to see some old
Thank
friends.
you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.